When Francis Galton coined the word eugenics in 1883, Victorian London was brimming with scientific novelties: Carl Pearson's New Statistics, photography as a tool for cataloging humans, the first anthropometric laboratories in the great museums. Galton, captivated by Darwinism, imagined that human beings could steer their own evolution with the same care an agronomist uses to select sturdier seeds. He was also driven by the moral panic over the dangerous classes. Poverty, alcoholism, and crime looked like hereditary epidemics that social medicine could not cure. When Mendel's laws were rediscovered around 1900, the belief that complex traits could be packed into discrete units seemed to confirm Galton's utopia. In 1904, the Galton Laboratory for National Eugenics opened in London, with Pearson overseeing a vast archive of family pedigrees. 2 years later, the Eugenics Education Society began handing out pamphlets to engaged couples, urging them to think about the genetic heritage of their children. In 1912, the first International Congress on Eugenics gathered delegates from 20 nations in South Kensington. They discussed blindness, deafness, feeble-mindedness, and tuberculosis as problems in social engineering. Even in those proceedings, the rift was clear. Positive eugenicists favored subsidies for families deemed worthy, while negative eugenicists leaned toward coercion. Opponents ranged from Fabians and feminists like Millicent Fawcett to Catholic physicians who saw totalitarian danger in eugenics. Yet, this early phase was dominated by techno-scientific optimism. Bell curves, composite photographs, and color-coded pedigrees were thought to pinpoint mathematically who ought to reproduce more and who less. The First World War soon halted the Congress fervor, but the seeds were sown and would germinate across the Atlantic, where progressivism, nativism, and immigration anxiety intertwined in unpredictable ways. In the United States, eugenics found an unexpected ally in the progressive movement. Urban reformers, white suffragettes, Harvard academics, and agriculture officials all embraced it as an instrument of civic hygiene. Charles Davenport, founder of the Station for Experimental Evolution at Cold Spring Harbor, opened the Eugenics Record Office, ERO, in 1910 with funding from the Carnegie and Harriman fortunes. Dozens of field workers, often young college-educated women, roamed rural America filling out cards on defective bloodlines, epilepsy, idiocy, kleptomania, alcoholism. Those very cards underpinned the first compulsory sterilization law passed in Indiana in 1907, California followed in 1909, and more than 30 states copied the model in the 1920s. Simultaneously, rising immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe fueled propaganda for a genetic break on supposedly inferior races. Harry Laughlin, the ERO's director, supplied dubious data to back the Immigration Act of 1924, which set ethnic quotas to protect Nordic stock. Rural fairs staged Better Baby and Fitter Family contests where infants and parents were judged like livestock. In 1927, the Supreme Court in Buck v. Bell ruled that states could sterilize for the public good. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, wrote Justice Holmes. Meanwhile, the Scandinavian Race Hygiene Society promoted similar reforms in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, tempered there by social democratic paternalism that claimed to protect vulnerable women from motherhood's burdens. Between 1910 and 1933, Galton's ideal thus shifted from academic concept to public policy, buoyed by statisticians, journalists, and Protestant churches. Warnings from geneticists such as Thomas H. Morgan about environmental influence and complex dominance had little impact. The Great Depression slashed funding for the ERO, but eugenics was already enshrined in law and popular imagination, ready for the regime that would exploit its repressive potential most radically, Nazi Germany. When Nazists seized power, racial hygiene was already circulating in German medical circles. On the 14th of July 1933, the Reich enacted the Gesetz zur Verhütung erbkranken Nachwuchses, law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. It created Erbgesundheitsgerichte, hereditary health courts, composed of one judge and two physicians who could order the sterilization of people with congenital mental weakness, schizophrenia, epilepsy, hereditary blindness or deafness, physical deformities, and chronic alcoholism. Between 1934 and 1939, about 400,000 individuals were sterilized, often violently, especially in asylums. Under Ernst Rudin, German psychiatry supplied statistics and academic rhetoric, while journals like Der Arzt glorified race surgeons. In 1935, the Nuremberg Laws widened the policy, banning marriages and sexual relations between Aryans and Jews, Sinti or Black Germans, turning eugenic doctrine into racial segregation. With war came Action T4. Children with Down syndrome or spina bifida were sent to ghetto-like clinics and killed by injection or experimental gas chambers, methods that prepared the genocide in eastern camps. Meanwhile, Dr. Josef Mengele conducted twin experiments at Auschwitz to unlock heredity's secrets, a notorious chapter of pseudoscience. Nazi eugenics revealed how thin the line is between academic sophistication and state barbarity. Statistics became legal justification, surgery a tool of terror. The Nuremberg trials exposed the link between eugenic doctrine and crimes against humanity, yet sterilization laws elsewhere, in parts of the USA and Scandinavia, remained in force for decades. The horrors revealed in 1945 forced a reckoning with language itself. UNESCO convened geneticists, anthropologists, and philosophers, including Theodosius Dobzhansky, Julian Huxley, and Claude Lévi-Strauss, to craft the 1950 Statement on Race, dismantling biological hierarchies. The Nuremberg doctors' trial meanwhile enshrined informed consent, no treatment without a patient's permission. Still, many sterilization statutes survived. In North Carolina, they persisted until 1977, sometimes targeting African American minors. Genetics entered the molecular era. 1953's double helix, the 1956 correction to 46 human chromosomes, Beatles' 1963 one gene one protein. These advances tempered crude determinism, but did not silence the wish to prevent hereditary disease. Voluntary genetic counseling arose. Couples carrying sickle cell or Tay-Sachs genes received information, not orders. Civil rights and feminist movements challenged medical authority. After the thalidomide scandal, women demanded bodily autonomy. The 1964 Declaration of Helsinki set ethical rules for clinical research, insisting on minimal risk and proportional benefit. By 1970, eugenics was almost banished from conferences. Scientists spoke of medical genetics or reproductive health. Yet forced sterilization lingered in Swedish psychiatric hospitals, Canadian indigenous reserves, under bureaucratic labels. The post-war era thus rejected past ideology but kept power over the most vulnerable bodies, foreshadowing tensions that biotech would soon magnify. On the 25th of July 1978, Louise Brown was born, the first IVF baby. Reproduction was now separable from sexuality, enabling pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, PGD. Embryos free of cystic fibrosis or B thalassemia could be selected before uterine transfer. The 1990s Human Genome Project stoked hopes of personalized medicine. Zinc finger and talent editing hinted at even sharper tools. In 2012, CRISPR-Cas9 demolished cost and complexity barriers. Cutting a faulty gene became near high school lab work. Only 6 years later, in 2018, He Jiankui announced in Hong Kong the birth of twin girls edited for HIV resistance. Outrage was swift. Almost all scientists deemed it premature and unethical, yet the genie was out. Startups in Israel, California, and China began selling polygenic scores, promising to trim risks of complex diseases, diabetes, Alzheimer's, or add centimeters of height and points of cognitive performance. Price: a few $1,000s per IVF cycle, within reach of a wealthy minority. DIY ancestry kits meanwhile spawned new genetic tribalism online. Regulators reacted unevenly. The EU kept its germline editing ban, the US froze federal funding but allowed private ventures, China tightened guidelines yet stayed a buzzing lab. In 2021, the WHO urged global moratoria until safety, efficacy, and equity are proven. Biohackers nonetheless marketed home CRISPR kits. Today, LA clinics let parents choose among dozens of embryos screened for millions of variants. Some gamete banks tout elite donors, Ivy League grads with photos and SAT scores. The new eugenics wears no brown shirts or forced scalpels, it sells options. Yet the outcome can still be profoundly selective, turning economic inequality into biological destiny and freezing privilege in DNA. Victims of old eugenics still seek justice. North Carolina and Virginia have compensation funds. Sweden has paid damages to thousands of women sterilized between 1935 and 1976. Yet psychological scars remain. In Canada, indigenous communities report coercive sterilizations into the 1990s. A 2020 U.S. probe uncovered non-consensual operations at a Georgia ICE center. Such cases reveal how reproductive control survives at healthcare's margins. Legally, the Nuremberg Code and Helsinki Principles cemented consent, but today's frontier is genomic privacy. Commercial databases, also used by police, expose whole family trees to unwanted profiling. Socially, framing disability as an error to eliminate fuels stigma. Movements like Nothing About Us Without Us champion neurodiversity and critique cure-at-all-costs rhetoric. Scientifically, polygenic scores, derived largely from European cohorts, mispredict for people of African or indigenous ancestry, risking misdiagnosis. Yet somatic CRISPR editing is delivering breakthroughs. A 2024 trial cured B thalassemia without bone marrow transplant. Still, the line to enhancement stays blurry. If a memory-boosting gene could be tweaked tomorrow, who would access it? Globally, middle-income nations eye genetic engineering as a shortcut against rare diseases, but face biocolonial risks as patents lock up essential therapies. The long shadow of eugenics thus looms over historical redress, present inequality, and future precaution. No algorithm can compute life's value. Society must decide whether to honor or erase that ethical legacy.